Good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events this evening. And tonight we have our friend, James R Benn, back with us, albeit virtually, to discuss the 16th in the Billy Boyle World War II series. And Jim has kindly signed a batch of books for us, and they're all first printing still, which is great. I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field here on Facebook. And if you'd like to purchase a copy, you can do so. And I'll also be monitoring that. So if you have questions for Jim or Barbara, go ahead and put them in as they occur to you throughout the hour. And I'll come back towards the end of the hour to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Jim, it's lovely to see you. I've been congratulating Jim before we started on the magnificent background he has for his Zoom. I'm so envious of the color and how neat it looks, because here I am in this disaster of an office. But anyway, I will point out that there has always been a particular look to the Billy Boyle series, which was decided, as far as I could tell, the very first Billy Boyle, and has stayed consistently looking like this. Jim, did you have any input on the basic cover design, the basic package?
You know, I am lucky enough to have a fair amount of input, and it all goes back to the first cover of Billy Boyle, the first title. And the cover artist had a small mistake in it that was an anachronism. And I pointed that out, and they fixed it. And since then, it's every year, oh, Jim, will you check this out and make sure the uniform is right, or this or that? So it's a lot of fun. After I send a book into Soho, they take my opinion and I contribute some ideas, some photographs and that sort of thing. So it's a lot of fun. And some authors, most authors, don't really have a chance to do that. So I enjoy it.
No, they don't. And I'm going to hold this up much closer just so you can see, if you're watching this, that the cover really is a woman. She's a pilot, and she has this little plane, which we'll be talking about. And I'm assuming that she's intended to be one of the Night Witches,
the
Russian all-female group, right? So I really, I like that, because so often the role of women in the war is not highlighted. So Jim, before we did this, I went back, I've traveled in Russia, and in fact, in theory, we're going to Moscow and up the river, lakes, whatever, to St. Petersburg next fall. And I studied Russian at Stanford with a Russian, an escaped white Russian, whose name was Ivan Ivanich Stenbach-Fermor. And he was wonderful. He told us great stories. And as I've said before, his gig was that on the weekends, he taught profanity at the Army Language School, because we were in the height of the Cold War there at the end of the 50s and early 60s. And the theory was that spies, agents dropped, behind enemy lines, needed to be proficient in profanity, or they wouldn't feel authentic. If, an injury, the Russian version of, they needed to know that. And he took us up to Russian Hill, where there was a lot of Russians who, left with the revolution, came over to San Francisco from Vladivostok. So thinking about that, I went back and I thought, okay, the Ukraine, which I've not been to, was part of Russia. So what happened? And I looked up the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and discovered that the Germans signed, or the Russians rather, signed a separate treaty with Germany, and didn't participate thus in the Treaty of Versailles that closed out the First World War. And as part of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they gave up the Baltic states, and they gave up the Ukraine and some other things. And that's been, a kind of, it's like the whole Alsace-Lorraine thing with France.
Right, and we're still seeing the impact of that today.
Absolutely. So the Russians have never been, while they were, quote, allies in both wars, they've never really been allies in the sense that we might want to think of them. And I think that Jim's book points out very much how that Stalin had a different agenda going on. And even though it was Hitler's detour into Russia that probably killed him, just like Napoleon's detour into Russia really put an end to, never was able to recover from that. And you really think, I mean, Hitler couldn't have been a student of history, right? Because if he were any kind of student of history,
exactly.
he'd seen what happened to Napoleon and gone,
Yeah.
maybe I shouldn't invade Russia.
Yeah, no.
But we've also, Jim, been watching Foyle's War all over again, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And the last three, if you recall, if you watched it, the war's over.
Yeah.
And it's flipped right into the Cold War.
Right.
And you know, the whole discussion of Russia and communism and, you know, Stalin's plan. And you talk about that in the book. So tell us a little bit, because I looked up your historical note when I finished it, particularly in regard to Poland. What was Stalin actually up to?
Oh, you know, that Poland is, I mean, there were so many tragedies in World War II, but Poland is a special tragedy because they were the only nation, as far as I can remember, that was attacked by both sides, by the Germans and the Russians, and betrayed by both sides, betrayed by all their allies. There's it might be in a different book, but there's a note that when the war was over and there was the big victory parade in London, every ally was asked to send a contingent to march in the parade, except for Poland, because the Western powers didn't want to upset Stalin by having the London Poles participate in the victory parade. So they were just hammered by all sides, and that puts Billy's friend Kaz, Lieutenant Kazimierz, in a difficult situation because he's sent as part of this team to the Soviet Union, and he is asked to leave his shoulder flash that says Poland behind, so as not to antagonize the Russians. And for him, that's a difficult step, but one he knows he has to take. So there's that undercurrent of distrust, which is strong with the Russians throughout the whole book.
Absolutely so. And I think what you were talking about in the book was that something to the effect of there was an attempt to provide some support for Poland, which, oh, there we go. In the summer of 1944, the Russians would not allow American bombers and fighters operating from bases in the Ukraine to bomb targets in support of the Polish Home Army's uprising in Warsaw. Right. Stalin wanted the Poles to be defeated by the Nazis to facilitate his takeover of Poland. Of course, Poland geographically is in a terrible place. Yeah. I mean, it's always been, you know, a pincer movement so that you could have armies rolling over it, heading towards Russia, and then Russian armies rolling over it, going west. And I've always thought that you must have put Kaz into the mix here in order to highlight Poland and it's all the things that happened to it.
I was aware of everything that happened to Poland on a surface level, and now after 16 books, it's astounding. I'm just constantly surprised. And you're right about the Polish uprising. The Polish home government wanted to greet the Russians as victors in Warsaw, but what the Russians did was just stood off and let the Germans annihilate them. And the air bases that are featured in this book, the American Air Forces there wanted to go to the aid and bomb the German positions around Warsaw, but the Soviets wouldn't let them because they were letting the Germans do their dirty work.
They were, and it's interesting. I mean, I suppose there was some sort of recognition of that by the Allies, but nobody was then in a position to really stand up. But, you know, certainly by the end of the war, several of Stalin's goals had already been established. I find it so ironic that the Russians overthrew the Tsar only to get somebody so much worse. You know, I mean, if you go all the way back to the French Revolution, you know, they created the revolution to get rid of the Bourbon kings, and then they got Napoleon. And, you know, so often revolutions end up in, you know, authoritarian regimes. I've always thought how lucky we were in George Washington, a man who could have, in fact, become king, and who stood, you know, who stood up and said, no, you know, we weren't going to do that. We were really fortunate.
We were unique. And I mean, just historically, I remember that from my undergraduate days in political science, and my professor saying, this is a unique country because we skipped that point after the revolution.
Absolutely did. Anyway, Billy is finding himself. We're in the fall of 1944, and I'm trying to remember from where was he in the last book?
The last book was The Red Horse. He was in Great Britain, recovering from the liberation of Paris.
That's right. Okay, and so you use each book as a springboard, to the next book to send him off somewhere. When you get to the end of Road of Bones, which is wonderful, you will see that Billy has got yet another. So part of your design for this series was to really look at all the different war theaters, wasn't it?
Yes, and to find along the way some little known aspect of the war to explore, because that's what I find interesting is coming up with that. And I'm sort of cursing myself in that I've been very rigid with the timeline. So these books are chronological. I don't like Philip Kerr. He just went any time, any place, brilliant. But now I'm stuck with a chronological series. So I have to look very carefully and see what was happening in the fall of 1944 that would be an interesting topic. And I had always wanted to write about the air war. I wanted to get Billy in a B-17, but I could never come up with a reasonable explanation why until this book and the situation in Russia.
Well, you have a really terrifying scene in the opening of the book where Billy is in fact being flown into the Ukraine, and it's really super scary the way that it goes. And unfortunately, when they land, Big Mike, when they have to parachute out at the end, they land in a difficult place, and Big Mike is like disappeared, and Billy doesn't know whether he's even survived their forced exit from the plane. And so that's part of the suspense of the book, whereas Kaz wasn't even on the plane. So Billy's on his own without his usual support team as he heads, as he needs to be rescued from what's happened to him and then sent there in the Ukraine. So he's now on the other side of Germany, which is a really disorienting kind of a thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And he's in a country that is just run by paranoia. So when he wants to go search for his friend Big Mike, who had a parachute out before they reached the airbase, he finds that he's not allowed to go off this secure airbase. He even tries to find a map to see where Big Mike might be. And in the Soviet Union, maps were illegal because a foreigner might get their hands on one and use it to, meet a spy, who knows what. I mean, it really is hard to grasp their thinking at times, but that's part of the challenge in this book is Billy has to operate within this paranoid environment to not only solve a crime, but to look after his friends. So
I mean, I think you did the paranoia part really, really well. And in order to investigate the inevitable murder that occurs, he has to pair up with whom?
Well, yeah, an old adversary. So in a previous book, there was a Russian diplomat who really was a NKVD agent in London, Kirill Sidorov, and Billy contrived to get some rough justice on Kedorov without going into details, but he had him framed as a spy, and Sidorov ended up in what we now think of as the Gulag. That term hadn't been invented in the 1940s, but Sidorov is sent to a prison camp where he suffered terribly. He then is brought back because we have sent Billy Boyle as the American investigator to investigate this double murder of a Russian and an American in the Soviet Union. So the Russians bring out Sidorov because he'll use his knowledge of Billy to shape an outcome that fits Stalin's desire, which is that an American will be found guilty, period. And Sidorov knows that if he fails, he's going back to the camp.
It's interesting. Whenever it's like the Allies versus the Germans, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Although obviously there are occasional German moles and spies, whatever you want to call it. But every time there's any kind of story where the Russians involved, there's always this hidden stuff going on, nothing's really trustworthy, as you say, paranoia is rampant. The purported agenda is not necessarily the real agenda. And, it's really makes you very uneasy to read, a story where you think, how hard can this be? You've got the American investigator, you've got the Russian investigator, you've got a murder of one each, and they ought to work together to solve it. But there are all these hidden, trapdoors, agenda, and so forth underneath what looks like it should be a fairly straightforward investigation.
Yes.
How did you get yourself in a frame of mind to, to write that?
Well, I blame some of it on Reed Frail Coleman, who issued me a challenge a few years ago. He said, why don't you have Billy go meet Joe Stalin? And at first I thought, that's a dumb idea. I don't want to deal with just the language issues of sending Billy to the Soviet Union. And then I decided, well, he's not going to meet Joe Stalin, but that's not a bad idea. I knew about this bombing setup where we had these bases, that this is a true part of the story. We have these bases in Russia. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? And it really also led me to get Billy in that B-17 because, as I said, I always wanted to do that. And part of the impetus was personal. My wife, through some genealogy work, found a long lost relative, a cousin who's a generation older than her, and he had been on a B-17. He had lost his thumb when they were through flak once. And in that first chapter, when Billy is brought to help dislodge a stuck bomb in the bomb rack by jumping up and down on it 5 miles up without wearing a parachute, our cousin Abe did that. He told the story of having to walk out on this catwalk, and they are 5 miles up. It's 40 degrees below zero, and it's such a narrow space. He had to take his parachute off and jumping up and down on a live bomb to get it. So I thought, Cousin Abe, we've got to put that in the book, and that helped form that first chapter. And I had a chance to try to tell the story about what it was like for the guys who went up and went on these bombing runs over and over again. It was terrifying. It was terrifying to write, and it was terrifying for them, obviously.
I don't think, I come back again to False War, having just read it, watched it, but I don't think we realized, just how small planes were and how personal flying was. We were looking at the RAF guys, that are going up on missions over the channel, and they're these little tiny planes. They don't have, they're wearing bomber jackets and goggles, and there's nothing of the appurtenance of modern, aircraft at all. And so basically it's almost like a skateboard situation, where these guys are up there in the air, but they go up surprisingly high and do some amazingly dangerous things. Was part of the training always that they had to learn how to parachute out? Billy hasn't had any formal parachute training, has he?
No. And I've never, that's an interesting question. I've never come across that, but I don't think aircrew had to jump the way paratroopers would jump and practice. They had their parachutes. Most of them couldn't wear them because of the cramped quarters, the ball turret gunner, the rear gunner. If something went wrong, they had to get out of their positions, put on the suit, and then get to an exit. And if you're doing that, the plane's in trouble. The plane is probably falling or burning. And their casualties, their rates of casualty were horrific. But it must have been an odd war, because they'd wake up in the morning, have a coffee, a big breakfast, go fly for the whole day, come back if they lived, go to the pub that night. And it must have been a very surreal existence.
Oh, I'm sure it was. And the casualty rate, as you say, was very high. There was an extraordinary number of people who died in the English Channel, which you can hardly even imagine today.
Yeah.
But without the ability, the other thing is, I've seen traumatic representations of how the British would fly agents into France, drop them.
Mhm.
And basically, like the Night Witches, they had these little planes that flew, because we didn't really have radar, even though Hedy Lamarr,
Right.
we now know,
Yeah,
came
right.
along and worked on that, developed it. But so they're gliding in, they don't want engine noise. So very often, they're just floating in
Yeah.
and dropping people, and then they have to take off again. And it's not like they have runways or anything. They're flying in,
Right.
to a field.
And by dead reckoning, by moonlight, or
Yeah.
following a river, or finding a landmark. It's incredible.
Yeah, following rivers is a really big thing. So the Night Witches, whose little tiny plane here is represented, how are they any different than the guys that I was discussing watching in Foyle's War? These are women.
It's somewhat close. The Russians allowed 3 regiments of women pilots, and actually these regiments were all female. So the ground crew, the engineers, the cooks, the pilots, and I think it's the only time in military history that occurred. It wasn't just a few pilots who were women, it's the whole unit. And these planes were crop dusters before the war, literally. They're old, slow biplanes. And as you said, they would glide in. So their job was to bomb at night, to disrupt the Germans, to keep them awake, to keep them on edge. And they would cut their engines, but the sound of the struts between the 2 wings would thrum and the Germans decided it sounded like a witch's broom as the witch in flight. So they called them Nachthexen, night witches. It wasn't a term of respect. They hated them. There was a bounty on their heads. So if a German captured one, he got a medal, a reward, and they just weren't taken prisoner. They were maltreated horribly. The women night witches, there was 1 pilot and 1 navigator in each plane. They were armed with sidearms, mainly to take their own lives if capture was imminent. So it was very dangerous. These things were like matchboxes. 1 hit and their gas tank would go up. They dropped flares to illuminate the target. So there were flammable flares right in the cockpit. Very dangerous stuff, but incredibly brave. And they were adamant about wanting to fight the invader. I mean, that's the other side of the coin that you see in Russia at war, is the everyday people reacted to the invader. And they, of course, later, they became the invader as they moved into Germany and Eastern Europe. But it was, I tried to strike a balance between those people who were just fighting to save their country and the machinations at a higher level.
These planes were so fragile. I'm interested to think that they were able to actually do bombing raids. I mean, could they get high enough, if they were gliding along?
Yeah.
How damaging were the bombs that they dropped?
They weren't that damaging. They carried 2, I forget, maybe 200-pound bombs. And again, it wasn't to inflict a lot of damage. It was to keep the Germans awake and on edge. The Germans actually started a similar unit, not with women, but with older planes that could fly in at night and do the same sort of thing. I don't know if you remember, there was even an episode of MASH, the TV show, about Washing Machine Charlie. And it was a North Korean pilot who would do the same thing, a loud engine come at night and just harass them. So it has been a tactic that's been used again and again.
So it was to, break morale as much as it was to inflict any actual damage. Well, then how does Billy we can't give away too much of the plot here, but how do the Night Witches matter to Billy Boyle while here he is over in the Ukraine, separated from his normal team?
I was really struggling. I wanted to get Billy in one of those planes. So the way it happens is he's at this base that's well behind the lines, and there is one of these biplanes there undergoing repairs with just the pilot. And she's just there to have work done on her plane. She's then going to fly to her base. Billy finally gets permission to look for Big Mike. So he hitches a ride with her. He's given her permission. He's sitting in the navigator's seat. It's an open cockpit, but they're flying in daylight, so that she doesn't need a navigator. But once they get, they stop at another airfield, and orders are waiting for her to proceed to bomb a target. And she said, well, sorry, comrade, you've got to come along. So then Billy gets to participate in one bombing raid with them, and to see the rest of them coming in afterwards. And he really gets to witness what it is they're doing. Because as you talked about these planes landing in fields and such, that's where they're operating from. It's just a field. And they land and get rearmed and go off again. And he forms an attachment pretty quickly with this group of women. So they help him, he helps them, and it's a way to tell their story.
Got it. And after the war, they really didn't get any recognition at all, did they? They were disbanded and never recognized for the role that they played.
Yeah. There's a curious parallel here with the French and the role that women played in the resistance, and how after the war they were shunted aside because they did things that maybe men should have done. And the same thing happened in Russia. These three regiments, again, a victory parade, this time in Moscow, they're not invited to be represented. They're just told to go back home, have babies, work in a factory, and they're forgotten for decades. But there's been a fair number of books recently that have featured them. So I think they're finally getting their due internationally.
What happened to a lot of women operations in the war? I mean, even if you read about Bletchley, there were so many women doing code breaking at Bletchley. And when the war was over and the men came back, it was like, go home. Yeah. You can't ever talk about it because you signed the Official Secrets Act. Nobody knows what you actually did. And you were supposed to just return to some sort of domestic life, which was extraordinarily hard.
Must have been.
Yeah, no, it really would be. Stephen Hunter is not known for writing books about World War II, but he's written two absolutely brilliant ones. The 47 Samurai is my personal favorite, Stephen Hunter, which is in the Japanese theater during the historical part. But he wrote a book called Sniper's Honor, which is about a Russian woman sniper, sharpshooter, who was at one point the most hunted woman in Europe. I mean, she was extraordinary in her skills. And he goes back and forth again because Bob Lee is in the present, and we're going back to the war. But so many of the things that he wrote about her and what she was doing, you echo in Road of Bones, and it does make you recognize that women warriors were just as brave and just as heroic, even if we don't think of them as often as we do.
Right.
The men. Were there any involved other than the photographers? Because we read a lot about, some of the women journalists. Were there any women involved in D-Day? I can't remember reading about it.
I don't think in D-Day. I just saw an article online that I saved to go back to about there was only one woman who was a POW in Europe in World War II, and how the Germans didn't quite know what to do with her. They didn't want to set her free. She was a nurse who was caring for wounded on the flight that went down. So I've set that aside, like I want to look into that a little bit and see what her story was. But there were lots of cases like that. There were a lot of women who flew into Yugoslavia on missions to bring out downed flyers, a lot of whom had been injured and were being helped by the partisans, Tito's partisans and others. So I think there's some hidden stories there that haven't quite been told yet.
There's such an incredible mosaic of stories that you can talk about World War II on the domestic front, on the war fronts, so many countries, so many different fronts, so many different things that went on. You're going to run out of war for Billy at some point, even if you slow down. But I don't know that you couldn't go back and do some retroactive pieces. You've left yourself plenty of opportunities,
Right.
where,
If something comes up, I'm sure I could gen up some reason to
yeah,
go out of
no,
time.
I think you absolutely could. And there's, a great deal of the war theater, because you're sticking to Europe, except you did write that one brilliant book set in the Japanese theater with JFK,
Yeah.
which I thought was a great entry. But basically, you really want Billy to be somewhere within the range of his uncle, General Eisenhower, but the European theater. But there's a lot of it that you could write about, that even though this is your 16th book and you've been all over. Let's go back all the way to the first Billy Boyle, because I thought you did such a great job talking about the Norwegian royal family and exile, the Norwegian government, because they got hammered so early on by Hitler and had to flee and settle in Britain. Actually, the fall of Britain would have been a lot worse than just Britain, wouldn't it?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Would have taken out, and there were an extraordinary number of Polish immigrants that managed to get to.
It's astounding how people did manage to escape just ahead of the Nazis and make their way to England, because that was the only place to go if you wanted to continue the fight. And I thought Eric Larson did such a great job with The Splendid and the Vile to tell an old story in a new way, because he just talks about that period of time so marvelously, and he makes it as if I had never read anything else about that period in England.
I have been to the Shetlands, and one of the things they talk about is the Shetland Express, which was, private people, sort of like the people who rescued people from, I'm going blank.
Right. Yeah.
What was the big evacuation from Belgium?
Dunkirk.
Dunkirk, thank
Yeah.
you. But anyway, fishermen and so forth on these Scottish islands who had traversed the North Sea for centuries anyway, did a lot to bring refugees from Norway and so forth, or to supply
or to bring
people in Norway, resistance fighters and the whole bit. But, the puzzle to me always was, where was Ireland in all this? I mean, everybody went to England. The Irish stayed neutral, if I remember, although many of them fought in the British Army. But, you would have thought Ireland would have been even safer than England if you were a refugee. How come they weren't?
Well, Ireland was an odd case, because there were a lot of Irish men who left to join the British Army. And when they came back, they were looked down upon because they went to help the British. They lost a lot of their benefits. There's a whole issue there with that. But also, Ireland was neutral, but it was a very pro-British neutrality. They shared a lot of secrets. There was a lot of intelligence that went on between the Irish government and the British government. But also, the British Prime Minister, the Irish Prime Minister, when Hitler committed suicide, sent his condolences. So he was still, I guess, worried about what the post-war world would look like. So that's another issue where there's so many subcurrents of loyalties, but so many Irish voted with their feet and went and fought with the British Army, regardless of their history as a colonized country. So I think that's the most important takeaway. But they also did inter a lot of people who came there. So there were there was a camp that had barbed wire down the middle, Germans on one side and British nationals on the other. They were kept segregated from the rest of society. So I guess the Irish just didn't really know what to do with the war, and they had also just been through their own civil war, and I think they were.
Well, they were. I mean, the end of World War I, brought part of Ireland anyway, not all of Ireland, under home rule that they'd been fighting for a long time. But I guess my real question was, why weren't there more refugees going to Ireland? Was Ireland just so unwelcoming? Because it was a safer place for a refugee than England.
That's a good question. And I wonder if it just might have been that we know about the refugees who went to Great Britain to carry on the fight. If you just wanted safety, yeah, it probably would have been kind of a nice life to go to Ireland, but maybe.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it would. And I was interested
Yeah.
talking to Ian Rankin about A Song for the Dark Times,
Mhm.
his most recent Rebus book. It takes place way up in the north of Scotland. And I hadn't realized that that was where a lot of POWs were kept
Mhm.
up in this, amazingly unpopulated and,
Right.
if you want to call it, sort of hostile landscape, but thin of people. And I didn't even think about. We actually had a POW camp here in Scottsdale, which I
wow.
found. Yep, it was down at Papago Park, and it was primarily German naval sailors
Mhm.
rather than soldiers that were there. And I'm not sure if it's an apocryphal story or not, but anyway, at least one person wrote a great book about it. They contrived a version of the Great Escape, and their object was to get away and have this little boat and float down the Great Salt River in order to, in order to get to Baja and reconnect or whatever. Of course, the flaw in their thinking was there isn't any water in the Great Salt River, so it all came to naught. But there were camps for prisoners and all the rest of it all over.
Yeah.
But Russia seemed to, aside from the Germans, they certainly seemed to spend a lot of time interning their own people.
Oh, again, they were so ill prepared for the start of the war because Stalin had gutted his own army. One of the reasons that he allowed these 3 regiments of women flyers to be formed is he lost so many pilots because they were just bombs sitting on the ground. So it's amazing that they weren't conquered, but I think it was the depth of the country as much as the
Russian geography, no question, was what saved them from Napoleon and almost surely saved them from Hitler. But also, these were people who on the whole were just tougher than other people. They were not pampered. They worked hard. They were physically really tough. And I think that probably had a lot to do with it. Too, there's a recent book by Mark Sullivan, who wrote a fascinating story, what's called Beneath the Scarlet Sky, set in Milan, north of Milan. And
I read that. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, really good book about, similar to the Nightingale, the Kristen Hanna book about an operation in France that helped people escape over, I think it was the Pyrenees, into Spain, which was neutral. But anyway, in the Beneath the Scarlet Sky, the Italian guy helped people over the Dolomites and into Switzerland. But now he's written a new book called The Last Green Valley, which is it's about a German family who had settled in the Ukraine and then had to recognize that they were about to be caught in a pincer movement with Stalin and the Russian Red Army rolling in from the east and the Nazis over here. And what did they do? Because there were a lot of Germans who had actually been encouraged to settle in the Ukraine for agricultural purposes, that they needed. Same was also true in Romania and Bulgaria, where they didn't have really enough people to farm. And so they encouraged a lot of German settlers, and that caused all kinds of difficulties when the war came up. So in Mark's case, he talks very dramatically about this family, I think they were Jewish, who tried to decide whether it was safer to flee west into Germany and try to escape through Germany to England or whatever, or whether they should go east and take their chances with the Soviets, because we forget.
Tough choice.
Well, it was terrible, but the Russians were as anti-Semitic as the Germans, notoriously so. And so there was no safe place for a Jewish family caught, in this vice between Germany and the Ukraine. Interesting enough, they all ended up in Montana. The families arrived and, lived in Montana. So who knew? Right. But there were so many similarities between Russia and Germany.
Mhm.
If you go back and look at it, it's surprising that the Russians decided not to fight with the Germans, but eventually aligned themselves with the Allies. But I'm going a little shaky. Didn't they sign a treaty with Germany at the start?
Oh, yeah, sure. They had a treaty and shook hands and everything and divided up Poland. But that was one of the things. Stalin just believed Hitler a little too long. He initially didn't believe the reports coming in of troops flooding over the border, and he just thought it was a provocation. And then finally, when it was couldn't be denied anymore, and when the first delegation, he was at his dacha outside of Moscow, when the first delegation came to see him from the Politburo, he thought they were coming to arrest him, which means they could have gotten away with it, but they were coming to say, you've got to get out, you've got to snap out of it and leave the country. So he almost lost his position over that, but I think he just
Well, how unfortunate. I'm grateful that he died young as it is. I mean, I think he was only in his 50s. I mean, he was a truly monstrous person.
Yeah.
And
he was about to unleash an anti-Jewish pogrom that had been in the planning stages for quite a while. So it was lucky for a lot of people that.
Yeah, no, definitely so. And he wasn't even particularly great at governing because they had horrible famines and other stuff. I read today I'm trying to remember the Journal or the Times or something, a controversy about a lieutenant of Mao who kept meticulous notes lived to be, forever, like into his 90s or something, meticulous notes about being with Mao through everything, and became very critical of him. And his daughter, when he died, gathered up all these notebooks and everything, and managed to fly out of the country with them before the Chinese paid any attention. They've ended up at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and now there's a big fight going on between, whether they should go back to China or whether Stanford gets to keep them. But the real point is that this material, regardless of where it ends up, it's too late not to disseminate the information in it. And, to take a look at the Chinese don't want the narrative of Mao to be a different narrative.
Right.
But the Russians didn't really defend Stalin in the same way that the Chinese have defended Mao. Although when I've been in Russia, it's surprising how older Russians have a real nostalgia kind of for Stalin. And it really is based on the idea that there was so much structure. They knew, if you didn't run afoul of it, they knew how things worked. And the Russians have always been governed by autocracy, always.
Yeah.
And, I don't think they have any idea how to function outside of autocracy. So basically, they just keep substituting one from another. They really do. But the Chinese are different. And I think it's fascinating to see how all this is playing out today.
Yeah.
Are you planning on taking Billy back to the Pacific Theater at all? Or are you going to leave him in Europe?
Well, no, I'm open to an idea coming out, but one hasn't yet that just would capture me and make me want to bring him there. And there's enough going on for the next few book ideas that I'm pretty well set for right now. So we're finishing up.
Fascinating stuff in Burma, fascinating stuff in India and so forth. But if you think, I always think that World War I, overset the old order and so many things crashed. But if you look at World War II, certainly in India, for example, it really broke the British colonial hold. And, we wound up with the mess we've got at the moment with India and Pakistan and all the rest of it. And anyone who studies history should know that Afghanistan has always been known as the graveyard of empires. Nobody has ever successfully managed to conquer and control Afghanistan. And why we thought we could do it, I have absolutely no idea. I
have thought of something to do with flying supplies into China over the Himalayas, because my father was stationed outside of Calcutta at an army base. So I thought it might be fun for Sergeant Harold Benn to make an appearance in a book.
That would be really interesting. My uncle, who was a Russian speaker or studied Russian, later went on to Columbia and became a lawyer in Chicago. But anyway, he was he was in India in that whole operation and never talked about it. That's the other thing. We don't, people were not confessional about their service. Most of them never really discussed it afterwards. So,
well, they didn't have Bob Woodward to write a book. So
no, very true. Anyway, we've danced all around the Road of Bones because the truth is we'll ruin the story if we tell you very much about it. But do be aware of the Russian background. Think about the night witches, these really brave women. Think about the Poles and what they underwent and what that means for Kaz. And Kaz's sister, who we have learned in previous books, whom he thought was dead, has turned out to be alive. And so, what's going to happen to them during the war and when the war is over. So there's so many threads to pull in these books. They're just fascinating. Patrick, do you want to pop back in and see if you have questions from the audience or questions that you yourself would like to ask Jim?
Sure. Not a whole lot of questions here. Pat asks, were the surviving night witches rewarded in any way after the war?
Not that I know of. The Soviet Union, you wouldn't have a lot of rewards other than doing your part for the motherland. But there were a lot of jobs for women flyers. That was one thing. The Russians were a little equal opportunity when it came to engineers and pilots. So a lot of them did go back to the crop dusting and that sort of thing, but no actual rewards, no.
Let's see here. Any film or TV projects in the works? I'm sure you've sold the rights to these stories over and over.
That we keep getting these expressions of interest, and I just read a quote by Pauline Kael, the New York Times film critic, who said, "In Hollywood, you could die of encouragement." So we get a lot of encouragement. There's always somebody asking about their rights and thinking about it. So someday.
It would be actually quite expensive to try to, because, you can look at Agatha Christie Limited or Foyle's War or whatever it is, and you can see, that they have managed to find fabulous cars. And, I was interested to see that the 3 post-war Foyle War, where he's engaged with the Russians, fighting communism, they shot the whole thing in Dublin.
Yeah.
Partly because Dublin, since it wasn't bombed, kept its Georgian architecture and looked like London would have looked like.
Yeah.
So, trying to work out locations and come up with the cars and all the equipment and all the rest.
Historicals are expensive. Yeah.
And the locations, because every book is different in a different place. It would be fiendishly expensive to try to do anything with it, I think.
It's amazing what technology can do now without looking cheesy. For a long time it looked like this was obviously a fake representation,
right.
But they can integrate historical photos and such in such a way that it looks real now. It really does.
That might be the solution. I remember when Star Wars first came out, how impressed we were.
Yeah.
Because if we'd watched Star Trek, this little ship was kind of never went anywhere. And then we got Star Wars where they're zooming along, through everything.
With screen holding a little UFO.
There was an interesting experiment last year or the year before. Alan Kershaw writes nonfiction about World War II. And the book was The Liberator, and it followed one officer who ended up helping to liberate Dachau. And they did it as a graphic novel. They used actors' faces, but it was clearly a graphic novel appearance. But as I was watching it, I got lost in it. I would have to remind myself that these were drawings for the most part. And I thought it was an interesting combination of live action and drawing. And I thought, well, that's a way to, get around the expenses. But I haven't seen anybody else take up that method. So,
well, there's a ton of World War II film, that, in fact, you mentioned William Wyler's in the back of the book. His what was it? The Cold Blue
The cold blue.
bomber crew experiences and all. So I suppose there could be some way to integrate,
Mhm.
actual footage or
Yep.
bring it up to speed to do that. I love seeing that because across the hall from me in my dormitory when I was a sophomore was Kathy Weiler. And everybody,
Oh,
I
really?
had to figure out why everybody was paying so much attention to her. Because not being from California, I really didn't think about the movie thing
Mhm.
and realized that, here she had this incredibly famous father. So we
Right.
also had, do you remember football back in that day? Bud, what was his name? Bud Wilkinson. Was the coach at Oklahoma who had won, like, I can't even remember, they had 30 undefeated seasons or something, or national champions all the time. And so his daughter lived across the hall when I was a
Oh,
freshman.
wow.
I know, but the thing is that when you're a teen, because I was only 17, you're so clueless
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that you don't, and this is before social media and all this
Sure.
other stuff that, it was unrecognized, all this kind of celebrity stuff, where today these people would probably be madly pursued and, on Instagram and all the rest of it. But looking back on it, I think to myself, how dumb was I? I really was. So sad.
Did either of you see that movie 1917?
Yes.
It came out. I realize it's World War I, but talk about a spectacular job of recreating the trenches and that the wonderful scene with the planes.
Right. Yeah.
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 Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, we can hope. I think Billy Boyle would make spectacular television, long form television.
Yeah, it really would.
It'd be
Who would
great
you
if
cast?
they could come up with, a way to integrate actual footage in whatever it all is and do something.
Well, when I was first writing it, it was Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting, who was my model of that era.
Really?
So he's a little too old now, but anyway, that's Billy Boyle to me. Is Matt Damon circa Good Will Hunting.
Good
Do you
point.
actually picture him when you're writing?
Yes, I still do. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, let's remember Billy's from Boston too, so even though the novels almost all take place out of the US, we have to remember that he was a Boston cop.
Yeah. Dorchester.
Dorchester.
That's right. A question, does Billy ever get to North Africa? You have plans?
Well, the second book, The First Wave, took place in Northern Africa entirely. In next year's book, which is entitled Shadows, it takes place a good part in North Africa, Crete in the Mediterranean, and then we go into southern France, and we'll end up meeting up with the Nisei, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which were Japanese Americans recruited out of the relocation camps that we put them in. So that's the idea behind that. But a good part of that, probably the first half, does take place in North Africa.
Have you ever dealt with the code talkers in any of your books?
No, because they mostly were in the Pacific. Yeah, but there were, when you were talking earlier, Barbara, about Russians, learning how to swear in Russian and how important that would be for agents. We had our own version of that. It was called the Military Intelligence Section. We took a lot of German, especially Jewish refugees who came over here and trained them to not only train our spies, but to interrogate Germans, because they would match them. So if you were a German American who came from Munich, you would be given a POW to interrogate who was from Munich. So you could know exactly how, you might know the street that he lived on, and they would really get into their heads. So the book I'm going to start writing this fall is going to feature some of those characters. And there's a book out, the Ritchie Boys, because they were trained at Camp Ritchie. And this whole group of refugees who enlisted in the army became known as the Ritchie Boys because they all went through that camp together.
You must have a wonderful time looking for all of these nuggets, these stories that are not as well known as,
and the fun time is
stuff.
The great thing is finding it. is finding like the Ritchie Boys and then reading everything I can about them and picking out where's the story for Billy in this, and that's the exciting part for me.
Well, you're a librarian in your background, so research is something. I mean, all librarians are faced with learning how to do that.
Yes.
That's really worked out well for you.
Yeah, it has. Yeah. It's good to keep that part of the old profession alive.
The end of the war and the beginning of the Cold War period is also extremely interesting.
Yeah.
Have you thought of any plans above and beyond, past the war?
Absolutely. I see so much potential. And now we're going to have to figure out how to keep Billy there because he's going to want to go home, I guess. But, he's got Diana. So, but Berlin, Vienna, and Prague, that's all fertile ground. So I'll be looking at that. I was kind of interested to find out that Interpol, the International Police Organization, throughout the entire war was headquartered in Berlin. So I want to look into what did they actually do,
Yeah.
And
Well, a lot of guys were not demobbed early. I mean, some of them, stayed on into the end of the 40s.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you could just, for whatever reason, they don't let him, go home.
I think it's going to be something to do with Kaz. I think Kaz is going to want to do something in Poland, and he's going to get in trouble. So I've been thinking about.
My grandfather was stationed in Munich for a couple of
Oh.
years after the war.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It must have been a heady time to be an American in Germany after the war, and those dollars bought a lot of marks.
You look at the monument men and so forth, people trying to save, art treasures and other stuff from the incoming Russians, stuff that had been confiscated by the Germans. But it's been more and more acknowledged that a lot of American soldiers they liberated a lot of stuff. And there's that could be an interesting operation for Billy in a way. It would be to try to chase down some of that post-war wholesale art trade and recover things.
And I've been doing a lot of reading for a short story I just wrote about Werner von Braun and all these Nazi rocket scientists who did an incredible job whitewashing themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, Werner von Braun was a member of the SS, and he knew about slave labor. He knew everything that was going on to build his V2s. But boy, what a PR machine that guy was. I mean,
well, yeah, and unfortunately there was the utility principle because the communist thing came to light so fast that they a lot of the Germans who survived were useful in turning towards Russia, which rapidly became the enemy. Hardly took any time at all. When was Berlin divided? Was it 48?
I think it might have been that. Yeah, I think until then you could travel back and forth. And there were sectors, but you could travel.
Right. But they had that whole, some guy wrote a really interesting book about the candy lift. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Americans flying into,
and they would drop the candy parachutes out.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically we went right from facing Germany to the Cold War with Russia and
Operation Paperclip.
Paperclip. That's the scientists. Yeah.
Right. So there's plenty for Billy to do all the way through the 40s.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It is interesting to see, like Speer and other, prominent Germans appearing on talk shows and writing memoirs, and, Galen, people like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And Speer was, I mean, again, he knew how to play the media. Not only his interrogators, but the press. And he became, the architect who was drawn in by Hitler's magical powers. And boy, he got off so easy. I mean, but all those German rocket scientists, it's just, they worked at a place called Dora, where they drilled into a mountain using slave labor, just like the Russians used slave labor to build the Road of Bones and killed hundreds of thousands. They did the same thing with Jewish prisoners from the concentration camps, worked them to death, built the V2s inside the mountain. And then he had got all his crew together and surrendered to the Americans and said, here I am, we're ready to go to work. We want to go to the moon.
Wow. I realized that I made a mistake here. I forgot to ask you the significance of the title. Why is this book called Road of Bones?
Sometime in the 30s, Stalin decided he wanted a road from Pacific port inland, just south of the Arctic Circle, not quite to Siberia, but 1,000-kilometer road. And the only resource he had to build it were prisoners, political prisoners, hundreds of thousands of them. So they gave them picks and shovels and very basic tools and had them start digging a roadbed 1,000 kilometers long. And because they were digging in permafrost, when these prisoners would die, as many did, they would just bury them in the roadbed and run the road over them. They calculate today that there are about 300 bodies per mile on this road that still exists, the Kolyma Highway. Because much of it is a dirt road, the bones keep coming up, like rocks come up out of the ground. So the prisoners who were working and dying named it the Road of Bones, and the name obviously stuck. And that's from where Billy's nemesis Sidorov is plucked. So he knows that if he doesn't deliver the goods, he's going to be sent back to the Road of Bones and probably end up in it.
Right. What was the point of the road?
It was a port city, but he didn't have many road connections to the interior of Russia. So it was to move goods, in and out of the country from
Over to the Pacific.
Yeah.
It's a nice kind of segue, Barbara, into our program coming up next. Arizona's Haunted Route 66.
There you go.
Yep.
How many bones per mile on that road?
Yeah.
Right. Which is a nice pre-Halloween kind of thing. And I will just mention, if you were to watch it, that Debbie Brennan, the author of Haunted Route 66, has also written Haunted Phoenix and maybe Flagstaff. I'm sorry, she's written several books collecting stories relating to Arizona cities. So you can, I think the Route 66 is fabulous, but I noticed that several copies of Haunted Phoenix have recently gone out the door.
Oh, yeah.
So very
Absolutely.
cool. Arcadia is an interesting publishing company that does lots and lots of local history books all over the country. So it's great, if you're in a particular state, they usually have like a slate of books that you can read about, specific cities or specific stuff to the state. And that's really fun to do. Jim, it's really been a treat to talk to you, as it always is. This is one of my favorites.
Nice talking with you, Barbara.
And what a joy it is to have 16 Billy Boyles. If you've not read any of them, you can read any one of them. You can read this one if you want to start. But it's also wonderful to go back and read Billy Boyle. All of them are in print, and move forward. So whatever book you enter into this series, I encourage you then to go back to the beginning and read your way forward. It's just a marvelous, marvelous series, and for so many reasons. So thank you, Jim, for spending an hour with us. Patrick, you're reminding us we still have autographed copies, right?
Yep, I did.
Excellent. So let me wish everybody a very good evening. And
thank you. And next year in person.
I certainly hope so. We'll get Francine to come back, and we'll do some wonderful stuff. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Take care,
Bye.
Patrick.
Bye.